The Montenegro mansion, an imposing neoclassical manor, stood atop a hill overlooking the city. Surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and wrought iron gates, the property was a reflection of the Montenegro family's wealth and prestige. Yet behind all the opulence, the atmosphere was as cold as the marble that lined the corridors. Helena Montenegro, the matriarch of the family, was the embodiment of austerity. A widow for over 2 decades, she was now enduring a new tragedy: the loss of her only son, Arthur, and her daughter-in-law, Carolina, in a devastating car accident. Grief had turned her into an even more rigid and reserved woman. For Helena, the only way to cope with her pain was to protect the Montenegro legacy and ensure that her grandchildren, Clara and Raphael, grew up as true heirs of the family. But Helena was not a typical grandmother. The love she felt for 8-year-old Clara and 6-year-old Raphael was buried under a thick layer of discipline and rules. She believed excessive affection weakened character, and the children rarely received gestures of care that weren't accompanied by a lesson. Clara and Raphael were surrounded by everything money could buy: expensive toys, designer clothes, and private lessons. Yet, what they truly longed for was something the Montenegro fortune could never provide: attention and love. Since the loss of their parents, the siblings had found solace in each other, but the lack of adult affection left them feeling lonely amidst all the luxury. Clara, with her curious and sensitive nature, often tried to approach her grandmother but was met with cold, impersonal responses. Raphael, on the other hand, was more withdrawn, preferring to spend his time in silence, playing with toy cars or drawing. When the children's longtime nanny resigned, Helena took on the task of hiring a replacement. She wanted someone efficient, discreet, and submissive. Someone who understood their role was to follow orders without interfering in how the children were raised. That was how Maria entered the Montenegro family's lives. Young, modest in appearance, with a warm smile, Maria seemed the perfect choice for Helena. During the interview, the matriarch made her expectations clear. "I don't expect you to be a maternal figure for my grandchildren. They already have well-defined rules, and your role is to ensure they're followed. I don't want emotional involvement or opinions on how I raise them. Understood?" Maria nodded calmly, her smile unshaken. "Understood, Mrs. Montenegro. I'm here to care for them, but I promise I'll do my best to help." There was something about Maria's serene tone that unsettled Helena, but she dismissed it. The hire was finalized the same day, and Maria began her duties immediately. From the start, Helena observed Maria with a critical eye. Despite her humble demeanor and simple ways, there was something about the nanny that Helena couldn't quite decipher. Maria possessed something special, something that couldn't be ignored. She had a natural way of speaking to the children, as if she instinctively knew exactly what they needed to hear, as if she could see what was hidden in their hearts. Clara, with her curious and sensitive personality, was the first to open up. One sunny afternoon in the garden, while Maria tended to the flowers, Clara approached her with a sketchbook in hand. "Aunt Maria, do you think I'm good at drawing?" the girl asked hesitantly. Maria knelt beside her and examined the drawing with genuine interest. It depicted a house surrounded by trees under a starry sky, but the most striking detail was the absence of people in the scene. "Clara, this is wonderful. You know you're very talented, don't you?" Maria said with an encouraging smile. "But tell me, why didn't you draw anyone living in the house?" Clara shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but her eyes betrayed her sadness. "I don't know. I guess it's because sometimes it feels like no one's home, even when we are." Maria's heart ached at the girl's sincerity. She gently pulled Clara into a soft hug and said, "You're not alone, my dear. I'm here, and I'll always be here whenever you need me." Raphael, unlike his sister, was more reserved. He spent most of his time in silence, isolated in a corner of the house, playing with his cars or gazing out the window of his room. Maria knew it would take time to get close to him, but she was determined. One evening, while Helena was attending a charity event, Maria found Raphael sitting on the library floor, arranging his cars in a long line. "Raphael, may I play with you?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Raphael didn't respond immediately. He stared at the cars as if deciding whether he could trust her. After a long silence, he handed one of the cars to Maria. "This one is the fastest?" he said in a near whisper. Maria held the small car carefully, as if it were something precious. "And who drives it? Is it you?" she asked playfully. Raphael shook his head. "My dad. He always beat me when we played." Maria smiled tenderly. "Then let's imagine your dad is racing with you now. Let's make him win again, together." For a few minutes, Raphael forgot his pain. He laughed as Maria slid the car across the carpet, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed like any other little boy. One afternoon, Helena found Clara and Raphael in the garden, laughing and running alongside Maria. The three of them were so carefree that they didn't notice her presence. Helena, with firm steps and a severe expression, approached. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. Maria stood up, brushing her hands on her apron. "We're playing tag, Mrs. Montenegro. Clara and Raphael were so focused on their lessons this morning that I thought a break would do them good." Helena narrowed her eyes. "It's not your place to decide what's good for them, Maria. They have a routine that must be followed, and you were hired to ensure it is, not to distract them with games." Maria tried to remain calm, though the accusation deeply unsettled her. "Mrs. Montenegro, children also need moments of joy. This isn't a distraction, it's part of their growth." Helena didn't reply immediately, but the rigidity in her expression made it clear she didn't accept explanations. She looked at Clara and Raphael, who were now standing silently, watching the scene. "Go back inside. Playtime is over," she ordered. The children exchanged sad glances but obeyed. Before entering the mansion, Clara held Maria's hand and whispered, "It's not your fault, Aunt Maria. We love playing with you." Helena noticed the interaction, and something stirred within her. But instead of acknowledging Maria's value, her irritation only grew. That night, Helena summoned Maria for a conversation in her office. The room, with its walls lined with books and a heavy mahogany desk, was a reflection of the authority Helena wielded. Maria entered cautiously, already anticipating the nature of the conversation. Helena, seated behind the desk, wasted no time. "Maria, I think it's time we remind ourselves of your place here. You're a nanny, nothing more. You don't need to try to be something you're not." Maria took a deep breath, trying not to falter. "Mrs. Montenegro, I've never intended to overstep. Everything I do is for Clara and Raphael's well-being." Helena let out a cold laugh. "For their well-being? Don't make me laugh. Do you think you understand what it means to be a Montenegro? Someone like you could never comprehend the responsibility and burden of carrying this name. We are not the same, we never will be." The words hit Maria like a blow. She tried to respond, but felt her throat tighten. After all, what could she say in the face of such prejudice? Everything she had done until now had been out of love for the children, yet she was treated as an outsider. That night, Maria locked herself in her small room near the service area, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, she considered packing her things and leaving. Helena's disdain was unbearable, and her patience was wearing thin. But when she thought of Clara and Raphael, their longing gazes, the way they hugged her at the end of the day, and the laughter they shared, Maria knew she couldn't leave them. The children depended on her, and no matter how difficult it was, she resolved to stay for their sake. Looking at a photograph of her late mother, a keepsake she always carried in the pocket of her apron, Maria whispered to herself, "I promise to make a difference. I'll stay for them, not for her." Despite Maria's decision to remain, the tension between her and Helena reached a breaking point a few days later. During dinner, Raphael excitedly recounted a story Maria had told him before bed. It was a simple tale, but it had filled the boy with imagination. And Aunt Maria said the hero in the story always finds courage, even when it seems impossible. Raphael exclaimed, his eyes gleaming. Helena, cutting her food with precise gestures, slammed her fork onto her plate. "Raphael, your education isn't based on silly stories. You need to learn about real things, not fairy tales." The boy lowered his head, embarrassed. Maria, seeing the sadness in Raphael's eyes, couldn't hold back. "Mrs. Montenegro, stories aren't just silly. They help children understand the world, develop empathy, and spark creativity." Helena stood abruptly, her posture as rigid as a tower. "Maria, I'm tired of your opinions. You've crossed every line. It's time for you to reconsider your role here before I make the decision myself." The tension in the room was palpable. Clara looked back and forth between Maria and Helena, tears welling in her eyes, while Raphael clutched his napkin tightly. Maria, her heart heavy, responded calmly, "My role here is to care for Clara and Raphael, and I will continue to do so as long as they need me." Helena didn't reply, but the look she gave Maria was enough to end the conversation. That night, while the children slept, Maria sat in the garden, feeling the cool air on her face. Her patience was running thin, but something deep inside kept her anchored. Perhaps it was the love she felt for Clara and Raphael. Perhaps it was the promise she had made to herself before accepting this job. Or maybe it was something deeper, a purpose Helena couldn't yet understand, but that would soon become clear. It was a morning like any other at the Montenegro mansion. Helena had come down for breakfast and, as usual, barely exchanged words with Clara and Raphael. Maria was in the kitchen, organizing the day's tasks, when Helena decided to retrieve a book from an office she hadn't opened in years. The office was a dark, storied space filled with the weight of history. Ever methodical, Helena began searching the shelves for an old volume. While looking, something on the corner of a desk caught her eye. A delicate silver bracelet lay atop a notebook. Helena froze, staring at the object. She knew that bracelet. It was unmistakable. It had a flower-shaped charm, each petal adorned with tiny stones that reflected light in a unique way. It was a gift she had given her mother many years ago for a special birthday. The bracelet had vanished after her mother's death, and Helena believed it lost forever. Helena picked up the bracelet carefully, feeling the weight of memories in her hands. When Maria entered the office with Clara, the bracelet was still between Helena's fingers. "Maria," Helena said, her voice colder than usual, "can you explain how this ended up here?" Maria stopped in her tracks, her usual smile fading. She looked at the bracelet, then at Helena, as if searching for the right words. I found it in the garden, ma'am. I thought it might belong to the house. I was waiting for the right moment to ask if it was important to you." Helena narrowed her eyes in suspicion. "In the garden? This bracelet shouldn't have been there, Maria. It belonged to my mother. How can I be sure you're not lying?" Maria swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the accusation. "I swear, Mrs. Montenegro, I didn't steal anything. I only thought." Maria hesitated, realizing anything she said could be used against her. "I have nothing more to say." Helena scrutinized Maria with a critical gaze, but decided not to press further at the moment. She sensed there was more to the story than Maria was willing to admit, and it stirred something within her, a restlessness about the past that she hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as silence enveloped the mansion, Helena sat in her favorite armchair in the office, holding the bracelet as if it were a piece of a long-lost puzzle. Memories began to surface slowly, like fragments of an old dream. She recalled her youth when the Montenegro mansion was still full of life. There had been parties, laughter, and above all, her mother, a woman with a commanding presence but a generous heart. And then there was another figure, her younger sister, Beatrice. Beatrice was the opposite of Helena. Where Helena was disciplined and reserved, Beatrice was adventurous and passionate. From an early age, Beatrice had challenged all the conventions of the Montenegro family, especially when she fell in love with a humble young man, an employee on the family estate. Helena remembered the scandal that followed. Their father, enraged, expelled Beatrice from the house. Helena, unable to defy their father's authority, remained silent, even when Beatrice begged her for help. "Are you going to leave me alone, Helena? Aren't we sisters? Shouldn't you protect me?" Beatrice's words echoed in her mind, full of hurt and despair. Beatrice left with the man she loved, and Helena never heard from her again. Whenever she thought of her sister, she buried the memories beneath work, responsibilities, and the demands of preserving the Montenegro name. But now, the bracelet brought it all back. In the days that followed, Helena observed Maria more closely. There was something about her demeanor, the way she spoke to the children, that felt familiar. It unsettled Helena deeply, yet it also sparked a curiosity she couldn't ignore. Finally, unable to endure the mystery any longer, Helena summoned Maria for another conversation in the office. When Maria entered, she appeared calm, though her eyes revealed a hint of apprehension. Helena held up the bracelet and went straight to the point. "Maria, I'll ask you one more time. How did this come to be here? I want the truth." Maria took a deep breath but didn't respond immediately. After a moment she said, "I thought you wouldn't recognize it." Helena frowned. "What do you mean? Recognize what?" Maria hesitated before finding the courage to speak. "My mother gave me this bracelet before she passed away. She said it belonged to someone important. She told me that one day I'd understand why she kept it." Helena felt a chill run down her spine. "Your mother? Who was your mother, Maria?" Maria met Helena's gaze firmly. "Beatrice. My mother was Beatriz Montenegro." The silence in the office was suffocating. Maria's words echoed in Helena's mind. My mother was Beatriz Montenegro. It was as if the weight of her past, buried for decades, had come crashing down on her in an instant. Helena stared at Maria, struggling to process the revelation. Now that she knew the truth, Maria's resemblance to Beatriz was unmistakable. The same determination in her eyes, the same gentle yet firm demeanor. How had Helena not seen it before? "Why didn't you tell me?" Helena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but laden with emotion. Maria took a deep breath, as though this moment had been building for years. "Because I knew you wouldn't accept it. My mother told me that, to the Montenegros, she ceased to exist after being cast out. She told me what happened, how she was disowned for loving the man she chose, and she always believed you could have done something to help her." Maria paused, her eyes glistening. "I wanted to see for myself who the woman was that my mother both loved and blamed." Helena felt the impact of Maria's words. Pain and guilt began to surface despite the years she had spent suppressing them. She remembered Beatriz's pleas, the way her sister had looked at her for the last time before leaving the mansion forever. "I was young," Helena murmured, as if trying to justify her actions. "I didn't know how to stand up to our father. He was so strict, so unyielding, I had no choice." Maria shook her head, her gaze firm. "You had a choice. My mother always believed you could have defended her, but you chose silence." Helena, despite her pride, couldn't resist asking the question that burned in her throat. "What happened to your mother after she left?" Maria sighed, her expression distant, as if reliving the memories. "She left with my father Antonio. They were happy, despite everything, but life wasn't easy for them. Without the Montenegro family's support, they had to start over from scratch. My father worked in a repair shop, and my mother did whatever she could, but she got sick when I was little." Maria's voice faltered for a moment, but she continued. "She fought with all her strength, but she couldn't survive. I was only 8 years old when she passed away. My father tried to care for me, but the grief consumed him. He died shortly after. I was left alone." Helena felt the weight of Maria's story, as though it were a physical blow. The image of Beatriz, her rebellious, vibrant sister, now seemed so distant and tragic. She tried to hold back the tears welling in her eyes, but her voice came out broken. "And you? How did you survive?" Maria lifted her head with dignity. "I grew up in an orphanage. It was hard, but I made it through. My mother always said the Montenegros were strong. I think she wanted me to believe that, even when everything seemed lost." Helena gazed at Maria, struggling to find the right words. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and regrets. She thought of all the times she could have searched for Beatriz, the letters she could have written, the apologies she could have offered. But she had done none of those things. She had chosen silence and convenience. "I didn't know," Helena began, but Maria interrupted her. "You didn't know because you chose not to know. You knew where she was. You knew you could have helped her, but you chose silence." Maria wasn't being cruel, but her words were pointed and inescapable. Helena looked away, the guilt swelling inside her like a tidal wave. "And now? What do you want from me? Why did you come here?" Maria took a deep breath before responding. "I didn't come for revenge, Mrs. Montenegro. I came for your grandchildren. They aren't to blame for what happened, but they need love, something you seem to have forgotten how to give." Maria paused, letting her words settle. "And, perhaps, a part of me came to meet the woman my mother loved but also resented. I needed to know if she still existed." Helena raised her eyes to meet Maria's. Her words cut deeper than any confrontation she had ever endured, yet they were impossible to refute. For the first time in years, Helena felt the full weight of her actions, or her lack of them. "I don't know how I can make this right," Helena admitted, her voice heavy with a rare vulnerability. "But I want to try, if you'll let me." Maria didn't respond immediately. Though she carried bitterness, she also knew she didn't want to bear that burden forever. Finally, she said, "This isn't something that happens overnight, Mrs. Montenegro, but we can start." Helena nodded, feeling for the first time in years a spark of something that resembled hope. The revelation that Maria was Beatriz Montenegro's daughter completely transformed the atmosphere in the Montenegro mansion. For the first time, Helena Montenegro seemed unable to maintain the rigid posture that had defined her for decades. She spent more time in silence, isolated in her office, or gazing at the gardens where Clara and Raphael played with Maria. Their laughter echoed as a constant reminder of what Helena had lost over the years. One overcast afternoon, Helena sat before the mirror at her vanity, holding her mother's bracelet in her hands. The object seemed to carry the entire history of the Montenegro family, its moments of glory and its hidden wounds. The image of Beatriz, young and full of life, emerged in her mind, bringing with it the memory of their last conversation. "Are you going to abandon me, Helena? We're sisters." Those words had been like a muffled cry that she had chosen to ignore. Now, so many years later, the weight of that decision was unbearable. Helena realized that her silence and pride had destroyed more than just her relationship with Beatriz. They had turned her into a distant woman, incapable of showing love, even to Clara and Raphael, who were still struggling with the void left by their parents' deaths. She couldn't change the past, but for the first time in a long while, Helena began to wonder if it was still possible to salvage the future. Maria, meanwhile, was also grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. From the moment she had decided to take the job at the Montenegro mansion, she had nurtured a clear purpose: to meet the family that had abandoned her mother and to understand why Helena, in particular, had done nothing to help her. But as time passed, her focus shifted. The bonds she had built with Clara and Raphael were genuine. They were not merely a means to an end. They were children who had filled a void in her heart. Maria realized she was no longer there to uncover the past, but to help create a better present for them. At the same time, Maria found herself torn. How could she forgive someone who had caused her mother so much pain? How could she free herself from years of resentment without feeling like she was betraying Beatriz's memory? She knew she needed to find a way to reconcile her feelings, not for Helena's sake, but for her own. One night, Maria decided it was time to speak with Helena. After putting Clara and Raphael to bed, she went to the matriarch's office, finding her seated in the armchair, staring at the bracelet. "Mrs. Montenegro, may I speak with you?" Maria asked, her voice calm but firm. Helena lifted her gaze, and for a moment Maria saw something she had never noticed before: vulnerability. The matriarch nodded and motioned to the chair opposite her desk. "I think I owe you an apology, Maria," Helena began, taking Maria by surprise. "Not just for how I've treated you, but for how I treated your mother. I failed as a sister. I failed as a person." Maria didn't reply immediately. Helena's words were unexpected but sincere. "My mother never stopped talking about you, you know? Even with all the hurt, she always said she was proud of the sister you once were before everything happened." Helena averted her eyes, Maria's words hitting her like a blow. "I didn't deserve her pride. I did what was easiest for me, not what was right. And I paid the price. I lost my sister, and now I realize I almost lost my grandchildren too." Maria took a deep breath, feeling tears prickling her eyes. "I've made mistakes too, Mrs. Montenegro. I came here full of bitterness, wanting to find reasons to blame you for everything. But I can't live like this anymore. I can't teach Clara and Raphael about love and forgiveness if I can't forgive myself." Helena looked at Maria, her eyes moist with unshed tears. "You truly are Beatriz's daughter. Only someone like her would have the strength to say that." In the weeks following Helena and Maria's conversation, the Montenegro mansion began to change. Slowly but steadily, the coldness that had once filled its halls gave way to warmth. Clara and Raphael, accustomed to their grandmother's emotional distance, began to see her make an effort, something they had never imagined. Helena, in turn, made a surprising decision. She gathered Clara, Raphael, and Maria in the main hall to make an announcement. "Maria, I want you to know that from today forward, you are not just the children's nanny. You are part of this family. I want you to stay with us, not as an employee, but as someone who is as much a Montenegro as any of us." Maria remained silent, overwhelmed by emotion. Tears streamed down her face as Clara and Raphael ran to embrace her. "Aunt Maria, does this mean you'll never leave us?" Clara asked, her eyes shining with joy. Maria looked at the girl and smiled. "Never, my dear. I'll always be here for you." Helena also felt the need to honor Beatrice's memory. In a heartfelt gesture, she created a small memorial in the garden with flowers and a bench, and placed a plaque that read, "In memory of Beatrice Montenegro, whose love lives on in her daughter and in our hearts." When Maria saw the tribute, she couldn't hold back her tears. She sat on the bench beside Helena, and together they remained in silence for a few minutes. "Thank you, Mrs. Montenegro. This means so much to me," Maria finally said. Helena took Maria's hand, something she never would have done before. "It's the least I can do. I still have much to learn, but I hope we can build something beautiful together." A few days later, on a quiet afternoon, Helena wrote in her journal for the first time in years, "I have come to realize that the legacy we leave behind isn't in our possessions or our name, but in the connections we build and the love we cultivate. Maria has shown me that it's never too late to change, and my grandchildren have taught me that forgiveness is the key to true freedom. Today, we are more than Montenegros. We are a family."